large Muslim population, large Serbian, large Croat, as well as Jewish, Roma, many other communities. So it's a really fractured state as a result, right? And non-functioning now. So people on the move could move into there, and then and they're all grouped in this northwest part of Bosnia where you have a much smaller piece of Croatia you have to cross. And that started not this winter, but the winter before. The people gave up after the brutality of those pushbacks. Every time you got caught, it was 18, you'd get beaten, your phone would be taken and broken, and any money you had would be stolen. Like the same story I heard dozens and dozens of times. That was the standard pushback practice. So people moved to here so that there'd be a smaller route. But what was interesting then is that you have a country where 60% of the population has been internally displaced or had a refugee experience, for one, like even much more than Serbia or Croatia ever had. Plus, 50% of the population is Muslim too. So I was really interested to see what form the route would take in those kind of circumstances. And when I first visited, not this summer, but last summer, it was an incredible atmosphere, the most shameless atmosphere I've seen yet, and some of the warmest relations between locals and people on the move as well. But both nationalist Serbs inside Bosnia and nationalist far-right politicians, especially in Austria, like Kurz, have been accusing, one of the Minister of the Interior in Austria said, we shouldn't talk about a Balkan route anymore, but a mosque route. So implying that, it was just a Muslim conspiracy to enable this mobility, this invasion of Europe, right? And so Bosnians who are applicants for European Union membership, realized that this was a huge danger to them. And so by the next summer, the relations are much more hostile. Bosniaks, so the Muslims, were sort of desperate to talk to me about how they're not like those Muslims. And so they had sort of internalized and were deploying a lot of Islamophobic ideas, saying we're moderate European Muslims, not like those Muslims. And also a lot of civilizational tropes, we're white Europeans, not like those dark people. So this whole dark turn had happened in response to Islamophobic statements towards them that they then, sort of in a nesting Orientalism, turned against refugees. And so it was a really bitter and unhappy atmosphere this summer, and over that 18 months things have really evolved. So there are definitely ways that solidarity can be broken as well.
Usually he's the first one to raise questions.
I have a small inquiry. Maybe joining from the correspondence between you and Rick here.
Yeah.
Well, it's about the refugee or people, stateless people,
Yeah.
and their situation of human rights situations. As you said, Hannah Arendt argued that. But I'm thinking of this Balkan, during the 1990s, not very far away, had been through the protracted integration war, and then we met some people in France, I think fellow graduate student or young scholars, showing us that they have a passport issued by United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how is that kind of practice, beside this, these people from the former Yugoslavian area. How many such kind of cases, or they are really exceptional?
Oh, that Nadia would know the answer to that immediately, because she really studies refugee resettlement and international protection, and That's why I have her as a collaborator, and I don't know, I'm afraid to answer it, and I'd give the wrong answer, I'm not sure, I really don't, sorry. It's a good question, and I don't know, yeah.
Just when we talk about right, human right,
Yeah.
beyond nation state, who can really provide? If not, UN is still limited, and maybe for certain cases. But on top ground, can we think of political actions? If they don't share the same language,
Yeah.
they not activate any political action, and can they not claim certain basic human right, the right to live, to be safe, to have food, to work, to belong, to move, and so on. So now we have, so this is a basic question. We would actually, I think they are challenging the concept of legality. It is not because they are shameless, but
Yeah.
they just don't think the legal practices fit their
Or they don't
living.
trust them,
Yeah,
yeah.
we can never trust them.
Yeah.
But I just interrupt you. You want to continue?
Okay. Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's on
You should
different
say.
issue.
Ah, right.
You finished?
No.
I thought you will have some aid or
But it's
answer for.
different. It's different.
It's
No,
different.
it's,
Okay.
it's
No,
not
you
an answer.
continue, yeah.
It's different, so, okay, go on.
Okay. Well, my maybe comments are quite remote. I think this kind of exodus,
Yeah.
massive crossing, massive migration across border, whatever legally or illegally, is as someone said that I forgot, but they mentioned that exodus and revolution are the two most antique political phenomena. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So we are actually when you make your presentation, I'm constantly reflecting of the past comparison of this, particularly the first half of 20th century, when there's within Europe and from Europe to the United States, massive.
Australia and South America, yeah.
Yes, massive migrations. But compared to this, the recent European situation, but I'm also compared it to, for example, the same massive refugee or migration happening in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
At about the same time, there's a migration from sub-Saharan to want to cross Mediterranean, and they have often stopped at the southern bend of Mediterranean, and they are experiencing the slave market. I watched some CNN documentaries and that kind of things. But also at the same time, for a country like Uganda, at the same time they are constantly receiving refugees from neighboring countries. Quarter century ago from Rwanda, and then South Sudan and DR Congo, and these refugees in Uganda, they mixed with refugees from other provinces like Karamojan. There seems no modern forms of concentration camp for them. They just mixed with local people living in the slum, in some corner of slum. They are distinguished from each others, and they can find jobs or find whatever activities or even marriage or something freely. So of course the condition is quite different because there's no pension or welfare coverage for them. But that kind of situation, I read a couple of essays from Western journals praising them as a much more human or way of that. So just
echoing the Malaysian example as well. Yeah.
But although Malaysia does not put refugee in general in kind of refugee camp that depicted by the mass media, especially the Western media, but the thing is that in order the refugees to survive, they have to work. But since Malaysia illegalized their right of working, and not even illegalized, because I would argue that this is actually kind of like no zone for them, because the law does not define whether they can work or not, clearly. So yes, they're renting a cheap apartment, they're living in slum, but it does not mean that they have a better living quality than so-called refugee camp.
Right.
So it's really, I would say, the Malaysian government attitude towards to the refugee is somehow can be really have contracted view, such as 2 years ago when the Myanmar Rakhine State having a major attack or something, I forgot what is it. The Malaysia Prime Minister at the time, Najib, actually used this kind of sentiment, but have a massive protest toward to the Myanmar government and mobilize refugees from the Myanmar, mainly Rohingya, as one of his political token for him to get re-elections, or showing him as a kind of like leader of ASEAN. So this, but in reality, this refugee does not have any basic necessity that's supplied from the government.
Yeah.
Most of their living necessity are coming from NGO, or whether they are make a little money for themselves and they're purchasing from wherever sources they can. So yeah, although I argue that refugee in Malaysia have to be recognized by law, but I also very skeptical that if law can solve everything, which means that the problem of the border has been solved, but obviously it's not. So although legalized refugee status in Malaysia, I think it's a must process, but in more further terms, we have to think that how can Malaysia really helping them as a community that need the help, not just as so-called refugee that somehow been radicalized their agency, because I think they also play an active role in Malaysian society as well. But I also want to say that in your explanation just now, it sounds very similar to me. That is like basically like Nicholas Genova talking about how the popularity discipline the foreign labor in order to make them cheap.
I'm totally drawing on his ideas with that. Yeah.
Because I also see the similar in Malaysian situation as well. But I exploring how to say in Malaysia context, but his idea is really helpful when I try to explore this so-called illegality issue.
Did you have a question at the end?
The last word is that the situation you presented here is a particularly modern form, that make so-called riot or insurgents fall. So the fence, the border, the armed, police force with water cannon, and then this kind of confrontation seems really a modern form. Compare,
Yes, yeah. It does, but I think you're pointing, there are big questions about the nature of human life that go right back to, that are raised, to go back to Deleuze and Guattari, it brings you right back to questions of, society against the state and struggles of nomadic people against their capture by the state, right? The way that James Scott has reread the history of of Southeast Asia, and especially, you know, hill people, right, as not being the remnants of some ancient history, but instead being those who fled self-consciously and purposely from state formation. And I mean, in his most recent book, rereading, you know, Against the Grain, rereading the archaeological record, he argues that, like, state control of mobility is so much later than we even imagine. It doesn't even, it's really, we're talking 1500s, 1600s, when there finally starts to be over, you know, a large, you know, that a majority of the population is even fixed by state modes of control. And that up until that point, there are still huge interfaces between states and non-state people, and struggles between nomadic forms of life and sedentary ones, right? The other interesting question with your reference to those kind of slave markets, I have a friend and colleague in African American studies, and we sort of puzzled over the question of the Black Mediterranean and the struggle in this. So there's the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean crossing, and then and some sub-Saharan Africans are taking that route, and I've met them along the route, but most take the much more dangerous crossing from the Libyan coast, right? And it was the uprisings there and the dissolution of that state and the U.S.-led bombing, et cetera, and the deposing of Gaddafi that really broke that route wide open in 2011 and 2012. But it raises, I mean, what Chandra Bhimo and I were discussing was, like, what the reorganization of the world economy over the last 500 years is, such that 500 years ago, you know, people were being seized as commodities and as slaves from Africa, forced into the bottom of a boat and dragged to Europe. And now people are paying in the Mediterranean to be put in life-threatening conditions in the bottom of a boat to try and reach Europe. And now it's the threat of exclusion from Europe, of being, handcuffed and deported from Europe, that is chained and taken away from Europe, that is the threat that renders people as vulnerable workers today and puts them and the enforcement is what drives them into the hands of smugglers, so that they are paying to take life-threatening journeys instead of being chained and dragged. So the economy has come a long way in 500 years.
So your question?
A brief remark and the question after that.
Please.
The brief remark is something you had to do as a Frenchman. At the beginning, at the time of what you described, when Orban closed the Hungarian border,
Yeah.
he was for the West European leaders, he was the bad guy, he was the outlaw.
Yeah.
And 1 year after, they did everything a la Orban, the
Yeah.
Orban way.
Yes. Yeah.
So this is something we should never forget.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, and now,
And the U.S. is doing everything a la
Yes.
Orban as well. Yeah.
so he became universal model.
Yeah.
Now the question, let's say in anthropological terms, what would be the difference in our context here between what you call being on the move
Mm-hmm.
and fleeing,
Mm-hmm.
being on the flight? I'm asking that because what is typical for this migration is that all the people are in a hurry. They want to reach their goal as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And this is why they make mistakes.
Mhm.
They are like a routed army. So they all take the same way instead of spreading. And they get stuck, as you described, etc., etc. So the question would be, why don't people take time? Why are we in such a haste? Because sometimes I might say, okay, you are in a difficult, very difficult situation, but take a rest. So, for example, in our case, why don't you make a detour through Albania, which is, people are very hospitable in Albania, I know them, they are very hospitable. You can take a rest, okay, and then you can recover, and then you go on. And this all the more, since for many of them, I mean, the goal is something which is not only hazardous, but it's nebulous. They will never reach it. They will land in a camp or something like that. And I mean, this affect or state of mind of being, it's so strong that it contaminates even the people who help. I mean, I have friends in
the feeling of emergency.
Calais, for example. In Calais, I have friends, French people. They're good readers, not questionable. But they cannot imagine that maybe they should not necessarily help people to try to cross at any cost, but rather talk about them saying, are you sure that it wouldn't be better for you to stay in France? Because the conditions in France are probably better than what is expecting you in England if you succeed in crossing or stay for months and many years in the jungle. So how could we deal with such an issue? Saying, okay, you are here, so you are here, stay here. You are not a rooted army. We can manage, we can find ways. But I know it's difficult, it's just a fantasy. But
No, it's not a fantasy. Those conversations are happening, actually. It's interesting. They're happening a lot. It's true that in the moment of, in the moment when it looks like a route is open and you have a plan and you have a family member somewhere, then you go, you don't eat, like people didn't even want to eat, they didn't even want to sleep, they just wanted to, well, they knew the borders were open to go. But once they're not open and they're taking those dangerous routes, there's been really interesting conversations amongst the radical activists that I've been working with, have such deep ambivalence about their fights to enable the mobility of people because, there was a moment when Greek anarchists were helping people on the move protest that Greece was helping to enforce the Macedonian border and wasn't letting people leave. And then all these Greek fascist Golden Dawn people came and started supporting, open the border so that these people will leave, right? Let's get rid of them, right? And so that caused some reflection on the part of the anarchists, and they were like, so they wouldn't protest anymore for this border to be open. They went to the They went to the Greek Turkish, I'm learning. They went to the Greek Turkish border instead and demanded that that border be opened and that Greece stop enforcing keeping people on the move out. That's like one glib example, but this difference between resting and travel that I said is kind of ambivalent. Some of the initiatives that I've been closest to and where I have like long relationships with the people who are participating, both people on the move and local activists, are like there is a social center and for migrants and local activists in Ljubljana, Slovenia. And there they really worked hard not to just enable mobility, but to enable people to stay. And they saw the project of like fighting Slovenian nationalism and decolonizing their state as they needed these allies in doing that work. And they tried to find ways to make life for people on the move better there. People who'd never imagined Slovenia was not on their map of where they might want to stay. But in those times when people are immobilized and they stay longer, they fall in love, they meet someone, they find a job that they could bear having, and people start to stay along the way. So I think those aren't just utopian ideas, but there are things that people are really wrestling with as real solutions to their lives, and that activists are self-consciously, some of them anyway, reflecting on. It's a dilemma. You want to enable people to do what they want, but you want to offer them a life in your country because your goal is not to cleanse your country of foreigners, right? Yeah. It is.
Yeah. I would be curious about maybe comparative studies of the same 1915 Romanian crisis. Right. I didn't study that in of course reading studies on that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened in 1915.
It started, of course, earlier.
Yeah.
But it's a major
Okay.
refugee crisis. And the route they move, it is different from here.
Yeah.
But they dispersed into Malaysia, of course, Indonesia, Thailand, and Sri Lanka.
Okay.
1950?
Huh?
1950?
Yeah, it's a major one. But there are, of course, precursors several times.
1915? 1915.
2015.
Oh, that's what I was saying I didn't know about. Okay, yeah, sorry, yeah.
The same
Yeah.
year, Mediterranean
Yeah, sorry.
crisis.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks for repeating this.
I thought this was some earlier history. I don't know. Yeah.
No. But
Sorry.
it, of course, started from earlier.
Mhm.
But anyway, that I heard stories, different stories. For example, people in Malaysia, some migrant workers, they just drop dead, and people just burn their body because they don't have ID card. Okay, and that's in the film. But also, of course, I think women knows a lot more about this. But of course, they have also local NGOs to support their education, childcare, and working conditions. But of course, there are also, I guess, underground activities, like the one that I heard people in Thailand, mostly the southern tips of Thailand. But for one thing, either in Indonesia, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, or Thailand, there's a Muslim community.
Yeah.
And also they have their history of traveling and everything there.
Mhm.
So they have also established their power relation, both economically and also gamesters. So I mentioned just now before you were talk that they were also hired by the human traffickers
Mhm.
and to handle the management of those boats, and also even kill
Mhm.
people they don't behave and put them over the wall. But also there are different activities. Of course, the human traffickers, I think it's a very interesting business. That,
Yeah.
Right. According to whatever crisis that emerge, and also they modify their practice according to different state policies. They demand higher price or lower price, and the lowest price might be to certain places like the fishing boat on Thailand. they had a huge fishing business, but they have this notorious slavery system on Thai boat. Yeah. So.
And shrimping too, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I was wondering whether according to this route you were depicting them as a collective, self-mobilizing activities, politicized, they demand their right. There are no violence or grouping or power hierarchy that some group will be bullied and so on. So they're but this is my curiosity.
Yeah, for sure. So just as there are, inequalities and some real arguments and disagreements amongst activists, there are even more dramatic ones amongst people on the move. And it was interesting. I mean, just to say a word about traffickers first. I mean, traffickers were the Balkan Route existed much longer, right, than 2015, but it was an underground smuggling route previously, and no one walked openly like they came to. What really changed was that it started to happen on such a scale that people could just walk openly, and there wasn't any way to stop them. And they weren't in danger of being kidnapped for not paying smugglers, etc. So in that period, in that open period, there was in my experience and from the people I've talked to, there wasn't a great deal of violence or fighting between groups. Once things began to close, things changed much more. And even at moments when there was when this route turned to go through, when Hungary did successfully close its border with Croatia as well, people had to then go through Slovenia, where this arrow, exactly where this arrow is pointing, and I forgot where I was going with that.